So as we see this legacy of views and treatments of the topic, we have to ask, where do these stances, these beliefs, these values go over time? Do they just disappear? Do we just ignore that they existed? Do these views underlie policy proposals today and regulations, school procedures, interactional processes? What can we do to trace and monitor how these deficit identity storylines, these are storylines that stay with us as they float across settings. What can we do to trace and monitor those and how they fill social spaces, emotional spaces, interactional spaces? Do we make time in professional settings, in school routines, to talk about our views of the surrounding communities and the role of language and ethnicity and immigration status? So we have to think about those issues and the implications they have. Now, institutionally, these are some of the institutional factors we need to be thinking about. Of course, those will be context-specific and will vary by learners. There was an interesting review of the research that Umansky and her colleagues did over time covering this. And she was concerned with how kids are classified and what is the experience those labels bring to them. And she found differences across grade levels. In elementary school, especially kids who were in bilingual and dual language programs, they tended to have a lot of positive and neutral experiences. They found comfort in their second language instruction. They had positive teacher relationships. When they were not in bilingual education, they had more limited opportunities in those studies, as reported in those studies, because the curricular materials were not relevant or aligned with their needs, because teachers were not prepared to address issues of language differences, or because the facilities in which these students were placed were not at the same level. Once they started hitting upper elementary, you began to see the effect of having more things affecting their opportunities and limiting opportunities. They were removed from core instruction. They were more stigmatized for that reason. There was greater pressure from high-stakes testing. There was greater social and linguistic marginalization. And they slowly, gradually began to internalize a sense of inferiority. Secondary grades was the big problem. That's when these problems that started to emerge actually got more complicated. There were very clear patterns of limited opportunities. They were isolated because of the tracking system. They tend to be placed in lower tracks. There were greater reclassification challenges, so you began to see the long-term English learners emerging, oftentimes because of test scores that did not allow them to get out of the category. And many of these places reported that staff saw many of the dual language learners as, quote, unteachables. So it's important to realize that you have to ask, despite the availability of the resources and the willingness and commitment of the schools for addressing these second language needs, we're hearing from the students that they are really having limited experiences in those places. And the older they get, the worse it gets. There was also other studies that show that this idea of being a dual language learner or a multilingual learner is also a fluid identity. The basic assumption in this study that was in elementary school, in Pennsylvania actually, a suburban school, the assumption was that disability is, to use a term, written on the body. It was very much connected to cognitive or biological characteristics of the students. And there were major issues. These students were not getting a good experience because of scheduling issues. The teachers who were capable of providing this instruction could not keep up because there were scheduling issues. They have to travel across the district to provide the services. There were so few of them that the scheduling became a nightmare because of that transportation demand. The scheduling was a nightmare for students, especially upper grades. They were overloaded. The interpretations of the guidelines were ambiguous, and unfortunately, special education was prioritized. And so when The staff were faced with the demands to address the needs of the language needs and the special education needs. Special ed won. And somehow, organizationally, the staff pushed ideas. Even if the students were in second language support, those programs were used to remediation purposes. There were also issues connected to contention and integration across gen ed, special ed, bilingual ed services. There was a rigid structural issue. Some of you might relate some of these to other areas that you might know about. I've heard this around the country. Things that are built in the system that do not allow easy communication and sharing of resources and expertise. One teacher said, well, ESL, which was the model used at that time, is just such a small piece of it. We just put it aside. We have other things that are more important. And the acceptance and understanding of disability and language, that intersection, was problematic. Most people in the district did not have a good understanding. This was a relatively new category. And I remember when I was teaching at Vanderbilt later on, it was the same thing with a lot of immigrant students moved to the South. School districts were desperate because they had no capacity and understanding of second language issues. And that created a very particular school culture in which students fell through the cracks, unfortunately. And the silos that were built, unfortunately, were not conducive to allow a better experience for students. And so one of the teachers said, well, I don't work with that person, so I really don't know what's happening. This sense of ownership that was critical.